The Wehrmacht's Army Group Center occupied a salient extending deep into Soviet territory by early summer 1944. Its forward positions reaching within 150 kilometers of Moscow along the Minsk-Smolensk axis. German intelligence assessments from May 1944, preserved in the Bundesarchiv Militär Archiv, indicated that Soviet forces opposite Army Group Center numbered approximately 1.2 million personnel across four fronts. What these assessments failed to accurately determine was the concentration of 2.3 million Red Army troops, 5,200 tanks, and 31,000 artillery pieces being assembled for what would become the largest single offensive operation on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center since October 1943, maintained defensive positions along a 450-kilometer front, stretching from Vitebsk in the north to Kovel in the south. The German defensive system, designated Feste Plätze, fortified places, centered on major population centers including Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. Wehrmacht doctrine, as outlined in Oberkommando des Heeres directives from April 1944, required these positions to be held to the last man, regardless of tactical circumstances. Soviet planning for Operation Bagration commenced in April 1944 under the direct supervision of the Stavka, Supreme High Command. Archival records from the Russian State Military Archive indicate that the operation's name honored Prince Pyotr Bagration, a Georgian general killed fighting Napoleon's forces in 1812. The symbolic choice reflected Soviet intentions to complete the expulsion of foreign invaders from Russian soil. The deception operation, codenamed Maskirovka, represented the most comprehensive strategic deception effort undertaken by Soviet forces to that point in the war. General Alexei Antonov, deputy chief of the General Staff, coordinated false intelligence indicating major offensive preparations opposite Army Group South Ukraine. Radio intercepts preserved in German archives from June 1944 show that Wehrmacht intelligence identified significant Soviet tank concentrations near Iashi and Chisinau, precisely where Soviet deception efforts intended them to look. German defensive preparations reflected this misdirection. Between May 15 and June 15, 1944, Army Group Center transferred 4 panzer divisions and 3 infantry divisions southward to reinforce anticipated operations in Romania and southern Ukraine. The 20th Panzer Division departed the Orsha sector on May 28, followed by the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division from Mogilev on June 3. These transfers, documented in German unit war diaries, reduced Army Group Center's mobile reserves to a single panzer division, the 20th Panzer, retained near Minsk. Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhard, commanding the 3rd Panzer Army in the northern sector, expressed concerns about Soviet reconnaissance activity in encrypted communications with Army Group Center headquarters. Reinhardt's June 10th situation report, preserved in Wehrmacht archives, noted increased enemy patrol activity and systematic probing of forward positions along the Vitebsk-Polotsk line. Similar observations reached headquarters from General Gotthard Heinrich's 4th Army positions around Orsha and Mogilev. Soviet reconnaissance efforts intensified during the first weeks of June 1944. The 1st Belarusian Front, commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, conducted systematic intelligence gathering operations along the Bobruisk axis. Captured German documents from this period, housed in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, reveal that Soviet forces identified specific German strongpoints, minefields, and artillery positions with unprecedented precision. The strategic situation facing Army Group Center had deteriorated significantly since the failed German offensive at Kursk in July 1943. Wehrmacht's strength returns from June 1, 1944 show that the Army Group fielded 580,000 personnel organized into 38 divisions. Of these, only 9 were classified as fully combat effective, with the remainder suffering from chronic shortages of personnel, equipment, and fuel. The 267th Infantry Division, defending the Vitebsk approaches, reported only 40% of authorized strength as of June 15, 1944. Luftwaffe support for Army Group Center had diminished to near irrelevance by June 1944. The 6th Air Fleet, responsible for air operations over the central sector, could deploy fewer than 200 operational aircraft. Soviet aviation assets opposing Army Group Center numbered approximately 6,000 aircraft, including 2,000 fighters and 1,500 ground attack aircraft. This disparity, documented in both German and Soviet Air Force records, would prove decisive in the coming offensive. General Ivan Bagramyan's First Baltic Front occupied positions north of Vitebsk, while General Ivan Chernyakovsky's Third Belarusian Front prepared to assault German positions around Vitebsk and Orsha. The Second Belarusian Front, under General Georgy Zakharov, targeted Mogilev and Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front, prepared to envelop Bobruisk from multiple directions. Each front had received substantial reinforcements during May and early June, with particular emphasis on artillery and engineer units required for breakthrough operations. Soviet artillery preparations for Operation Bagration exceeded those employed at Stalingrad or Kursk. The Third Belarusian Front alone concentrated 2,400 guns and mortars for the assault on German positions around Vitebsk. Artillery density reached 200 pieces per kilometer of front in breakthrough sectors, supported by multiple rocket launcher regiments equipped with Katyusha systems. Soviet doctrine, as outlined in the 1944 edition of Combat Regulations for Artillery, called for preparatory bombardments lasting 2 to 3 hours, followed by rolling barrages advancing at 100 meters per minute. The German command structure proved increasingly dysfunctional as the strategic situation deteriorated. Hitler's Directive No. 11, issued on March 8, 1944, explicitly prohibited voluntary withdrawals from fortified positions without express permission from the Führer. This directive, preserved in the German Federal Archives, effectively eliminated tactical flexibility for German commanders facing superior Soviet forces. Field Marshal Busch, like his contemporaries, found himself bound by orders that ignored battlefield realities. Weather conditions during the second week of June 1944 favored Soviet offensive operations. Meteorological records from the region indicate clear skies with temperatures reaching 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. Road conditions, previously hampered by spring mud, had improved sufficiently to support mechanized operations. Soviet logistics units had constructed multiple supply routes through partisan-controlled territories, ensuring adequate ammunition and fuel for sustained operations. The final preparatory phase of Operation Bagration commenced on June 19, 1944, with the initiation of widespread partisan activities throughout German-occupied Belarus. Partisan units, coordinated by the Central Staff of the Partisan Movement, conducted over 10,000 separate sabotage operations against German communications and supply lines. Railway traffic in the Army Group Center rear area decreased by 75% during the 48 hours preceding the main offensive, according to German transportation records. Soviet forces completed their assault preparations during the night of June 22-23, 1944, exactly 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The symbolic timing reflected Stalin's personal approval of the operation's commencement date. Forward observers reported German defensive positions showing no signs of unusual activity, confirming that strategic surprise had been achieved. Soviet artillery opened fire along the entire Army Group Center front at 05 hours on June 23, 1944. The bombardment intensity exceeded German expectations, with some positions receiving over 500 rounds per square kilometer during the first hour. The 252nd Infantry Division, defending the Vitebsk northern approaches, reported complete destruction of forward command post within the first 30 minutes of the barrage. Radio communications with higher headquarters ceased almost immediately, leaving isolated German units without coordination or fire support. The Third Belarusian Front launched its main assault at 06 hours, with the 39th and 5th Armies advancing simultaneously against German positions north and south of Vitebsk. Soviet attack formations employed standard breakthrough tactics. Engineer battalions cleared paths through German minefields, while self-propelled artillery guns provided direct fire support against German strongpoints. The 252nd Infantry Division's War Diary, recovered from divisional headquarters after the battle, recorded that Soviet forces achieved penetrations of 2 to 3 kilometers within the first 2 hours of the assault. General Georg Hans Reinhardt attempted to coordinate 3rd Panzer Army's response from his headquarters in Vitebsk. Communications logs preserved in German archives show that contact with forward divisions became increasingly sporadic after 7:30 hours. The 206th Infantry Division, defending the Obol sector north of Vitebsk, transmitted its final coherent situation report at 08:15 hours, indicating enemy armor penetrating defensive positions in battalion strength. Simultaneously, the First Baltic Front initiated its assault against German positions west of Vitebsk. The 4th Shock Army, supported by the 3rd Air Army, achieved breakthrough on a 15-kilometer front by 10 hours. Soviet tank brigades, following closely behind the infantry, exploited these penetrations to threaten German rear areas. The speed of the Soviet advance surprised German commanders accustomed to more methodical enemy operations during previous offensive actions. The Orsha sector witnessed equally devastating Soviet attacks beginning at 05:30 hours. The 2nd Belarusian Front's artillery preparation focused on German positions held by the 78th Assault Division and elements of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. Soviet doctrine emphasized concentration of firepower on narrow breakthrough sectors rather than dispersed bombardment across the entire front. This approach achieved local fire superiority ratios exceeding 10.1 in critical areas. General Gotthard Heinrichs' 4th Army headquarters received increasingly desperate reports from forward commanders throughout the morning of June 23rd. The 78th Assault Division reported at 09:45 hours that Soviet forces had penetrated the main defensive line at multiple points. Heinrichs' attempts to commit local reserves proved futile, as Soviet aviation had effectively interdicted German movement in forward areas. The division's final transmission, recorded at 11:20 hours, stated simply, "Position no longer tenable. Attempting withdrawal." The Bobruisk operation commenced with particular complexity due to the marshy terrain surrounding the town. Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front employed specialized engineer units equipped with fascines and corduroy road materials to enable mechanized forces to operate in the difficult terrain. The 9th Tank Corps advanced along the single viable approach route, while rifle divisions conducted supporting attacks from multiple directions. German defenders, primarily elements of the 35th Infantry Division, found themselves unable to maintain coherent defensive positions due to the terrain constraints. Soviet aviation achieved air superiority within hours of the offensive's commencement. The 1st Air Army conducted over 3,000 sorties on June 23rd, focusing on German airfields, communication centers, and troop concentrations. German air opposition proved negligible. The 6th Air Fleet managed only 15 combat sorties during the entire first day of operations. Soviet ground attack aircraft operated with virtual impunity, contributing significantly to the rapid collapse of German defensive cohesion. Field Marshal Busch received authorization from Hitler to conduct limited tactical withdrawals at 14:30 hours on June 23rd. This permission came too late to influence the battle's outcome meaningfully. German forces were already in retreat or surrounded at multiple points along the front. The 206th Infantry Division had ceased to exist as a fighting unit, while the 252nd Infantry Division retained only scattered battle groups attempting to escape encirclement around Vitebsk. The Soviet exploitation phase began earlier than planned due to the rapid breakdown of German resistance. Tank Corps commanders received authorization to advance beyond their initial objectives, while German forces remained disorganized. The 5th Guards, Tank Army's 3rd Guards Tank Corps, advanced 25 kilometers beyond Orsha by the evening of June 23rd, threatening German communication lines to Minsk. Similar penetrations occurred across the entire front, creating multiple crisis points for German commanders. German attempts to establish new defensive positions proved unsuccessful due to the speed of Soviet advances and the effectiveness of partisan activities in the rear areas. The 4th Army's designated fallback positions along the Dnieper River could not be occupied because Soviet forces had already advanced beyond them in several sectors. Engineer units attempting to prepare defensive obstacles found their work constantly disrupted by partisan attacks on supply convoys and work parties. The encirclement of Vitebsk became complete by the evening of June 24th, as Soviet forces from the 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts linked up west of the city. Approximately 35,000 German troops from the 3rd Panzer Army found themselves trapped without adequate supplies or ammunition. General Friedrich Gollwitzer, commanding the Vitebsk garrison, requested permission to attempt a breakout at 20 hours on June 24th. Hitler's headquarters denied this request, ordering the garrison to hold position and await relief. The relief operation never materialized. German mobile reserves had been committed piecemeal to address multiple breakthrough points, leaving no substantial force available for counterattack operations. The 20th Panzer Division, Army Group Center's last significant armored reserve, received conflicting orders to support operations at both Vitebsk and Orsha simultaneously. Division Commander General Mortimer von Kessel reported these contradictory directives to Corps headquarters but received no clarification. Soviet forces continued their advance during the night of June 24, 25, employing techniques developed during previous offensive operations. Tank units advanced along multiple parallel routes to avoid German defensive concentrations, while rifle divisions conducted night attacks to maintain pressure on retreating German forces. The 11th Guards Army achieved a penetration of 35 kilometers beyond its original objectives by dawn on June 25th, reaching positions that threatened to cut off the entire German Fourth Army. Weather conditions remained favorable for Soviet operations throughout the first week of the offensive. Clear skies enabled continuous air operations, while good road conditions facilitated rapid mechanized advances. German forces, lacking adequate air cover and suffering from fuel shortages, could not take advantage of interior lines to shift forces between threatened sectors. The Wehrmacht's traditional tactical flexibility had been effectively neutralized by Soviet operational superiority. Communication failures plagued German defensive efforts from the offensive's first hours. Soviet artillery had systematically targeted German communication centers, while partisan activities disrupted telephone and telegraph lines in rear areas. Army Group Center headquarters lost contact with the 3rd Panzer Army by June 25th, operating without accurate information about the northern sector's situation. Similar communication breakdowns affected coordination between Corps and divisional headquarters throughout the Army Group's area of responsibility. The psychological impact of the Soviet offensive's initial success became evident in German unit reports from June 25, 26. References to panic and disorderly retreat appeared with increasing frequency in situation reports reaching higher headquarters. The 267th Infantry Division's final transmission described complete breakdown of unit cohesion as Soviet forces overran divisional rear areas. Such language, rarely used in Wehrmacht documentation, indicated the unprecedented nature of the military collapse occurring across the Central Front. The collapse of organized German resistance accelerated dramatically during the final week of June 1944. By June 26th, Soviet forces had advanced over 100 kilometers from their original positions, creating a gap in German defenses that extended from the Baltic approaches to the Pripyat marshes. Army Group Center, once the Wehrmacht's most formidable formation on the Eastern Front, had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military organization. German casualties exceeded 300,000 personnel within the first 5 days of operations, according to Wehrmacht medical service records preserved in military archives. The encirclement battles reached their conclusion with systematic Soviet reduction of German pocket positions. The Vitebsk garrison, surrounded since June 24th, attempted a breakout operation during the night of June 26-27. Approximately 8,000 German troops under General Gollwitzer's command broke through Soviet lines initially but were intercepted by mobile detachments from the 39th Army. Only 1,500 German personnel successfully reached German lines. The remainder were killed or captured. Gollwitzer died during the breakout attempt, along with most of his staff officers. The Bobruisk encirclement proved even more devastating for German forces. Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front had surrounded approximately 50,000 German troops from the 9th Army by June 27th. Unlike Vitebsk, no breakout attempt was authorized. German forces in the Bobruisk pocket suffered from acute shortages of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Soviet artillery conducted systematic bombardment of the pocket area, while ground forces tightened the encirclement ring. The pocket's resistance ended on June 29th, with the surrender of 20,000 German personnel. The remainder had been killed during the siege. Field Marshal Busch was dismissed from command on June 28, 1944, replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. Hitler's decision reflected the magnitude of the military disaster rather than any particular failures by Busch personally. Model inherited a situation that was already beyond recovery. German forces were in full retreat across the entire front, with Soviet mechanized units advancing toward Minsk and threatening to encircle additional German formations. Model's reputation as a defensive specialist proved irrelevant given the complete breakdown of German resistance capabilities. Soviet forces liberated Minsk on July 3, 1944, completing the destruction of Army Group Center's organized resistance. The Belarusian capital had been under German occupation for 2,100 days, during which time the city's population decreased from 270,000 to fewer than 50,000 inhabitants. Soviet units entering the city found extensive evidence of German occupation policies, including the remains of the Minsk ghetto and multiple execution sites. The liberation of Minsk marked the effective completion of Operation Bagration's primary objectives. The strategic implications of Army Group Center's destruction extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German losses totaled approximately 450,000 personnel, including 12 generals killed or captured. 28 divisions were eliminated entirely, with an additional 50 divisions suffering casualties exceeding 50% of authorized strength. Equipment losses included over 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 57,000 motor vehicles. These figures, compiled from German quartermaster records, represented the Wehrmacht's most devastating single defeat on any front during World War II. The collapse of German defenses in Belarus created a gap of over 400 kilometers in the Eastern Front. Soviet forces exploited this breakthrough to advance toward the Baltic states, Poland, and East Prussia. The Red Army crossed the pre-war Polish border on July 18, 1944, marking the beginning of combat operations on territory that Germany had controlled since 1939. The strategic initiative had shifted decisively to Soviet forces, who now possessed the capability to conduct sustained offensive operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. German attempts to establish new defensive positions proved largely unsuccessful due to the speed of Soviet advances and the Wehrmacht's depleted reserves. The Königsberg operation began in late July as Soviet forces advanced into East Prussia, while other elements moved toward the Baltic ports of Riga and Tallinn. German forces in the Baltic states faced potential encirclement as Soviet mechanized units advanced faster than German infantry could retreat. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine, based on holding prepared positions, became irrelevant in the face of Soviet operational mobility. International reaction to Operation Bagration's success varied according to national interests and strategic perspectives. British intelligence assessments, preserved in the National Archives, recognize the operation's significance in hastening Germany's overall defeat. American military attachés reported that Soviet capabilities had exceeded previous Western estimates of Red Army effectiveness. German allies, particularly Finland and Romania, began considering separate peace negotiations as the strategic balance shifted decisively against the Axis powers. The human cost of Operation Bagration extended beyond military casualties to encompass the civilian population of occupied Belarus. Soviet forces discovered extensive evidence of German occupation policies, including systematic murder of Jewish populations, partisan reprisals against Belarusian villages, and forced labor deportations. The Extraordinary State Commission for Investigation of Nazi War Crimes documented over 600 mass execution sites across the liberated territory. These findings provided evidence for subsequent war crimes prosecutions while demonstrating the occupation's brutality. Soviet losses during Operation Bagration, while significant, remained proportionally lower than German casualties. Red Army casualties totaled approximately 180,000 personnel, including 40,000 killed in action. Equipment losses included 822 tanks and self-propelled guns, substantially fewer than German losses in the same categories. The favorable casualty exchange reflected improved Soviet tactics, overwhelming numerical superiority, and the effectiveness of deception operations that achieved strategic surprise. The operation's conclusion marked a fundamental shift in the Eastern Front's character. German forces no longer possessed the capability to conduct major offensive operations, while Soviet forces demonstrated the ability to destroy entire army groups through coordinated multi-front operations. The Wehrmacht's defeat in Belarus exceeded even the Stalingrad disaster in its scope and strategic implications. Army Group Center's destruction removed Germany's last substantial reserve formation on the Eastern Front, leaving the Wehrmacht capable only of defensive operations with inadequate resources. Operation Bagration's success validated Soviet military doctrine developed through 3 years of warfare against German forces. The combination of strategic deception, concentrated artillery preparation, coordinated multi-front operations, and rapid exploitation of breakthrough achieved decisive victory within 2 weeks. Soviet commanders had learned to coordinate air, ground, and partisan forces effectively while maintaining operational surprise against an experienced enemy. These capabilities would prove decisive in subsequent operations, leading to Germany's final defeat. The liberation of Belarus restored Soviet control over territory occupied since June 1941. The reconstruction of devastated cities, restoration of industrial facilities, and re-establishment of civil administration began immediately following military operations. The strategic victory at such enormous cost demonstrated the Red Army's evolution from the disorganized force that had suffered devastating defeats in 1941 to the formidable military organization that destroyed Army Group Center in 1944. The operation's success marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's Eastern Front resistance.